Oh, the UK is at risk of being sidelined in global affairs as a result of Brexit. That was said by Peter Ricketts, chair of the European Affairs Committee in the British House of Lords. However, Ricketts also hailed a thawing in EU-UK relations. EU-UK diplomatic relations, once strained, improved significantly after the Windsor Agreement was passed. The agreement, concluded with the EU in February 2023, regulates the exchange of goods between the United Kingdom and Ireland, and ultimately also the European internal market. The Windsor framework would be a bright spot for the whole relationship, as Ricketts, a former ambassador to France and former permanent representative to NATO, told magazines in interviews. Previous negotiations on the Northern Ireland Protocol had highlighted tensions between the two parties, which had been marked by a fundamental lack of trust and confidence, he said. The agreement does not guarantee further diplomatic improvements, but it makes them possible, in his view. The war in Ukraine and the imposition of international sanctions on Moscow have fostered close and productive cooperation between the EU and the UK, according to a report on the future UK-EU relationship. The findings, released by the UK Parliament's European Affairs Committee in April, a few months before Ricketts took over the presidency, call on the UK government to engage with the EU in a more structured and non-ad hoc manner, particularly on foreign policy issues. In terms of sanctions, there's now de facto very close cooperation between both parties, Ricketts said. He called for an improvement in systematic cooperation in all areas, including security and foreign policy, in contrast to the previous issue-by-issue approach that has prevailed under British leadership. He added that the UK government should join the EU's defence-oriented permanent structured cooperation, the PESCO projects, whenever possible. Asked whether Brexit is weakening the UK's position on the international stage, Ricketts said, "I personally believe there is a risk of being sidelined in global affairs, where it would be more difficult for the UK to make their voices heard in a world of blocs, dominated by great power competition." As a smaller player than the US or the EU, the UK risks losing some of its normative influence. It may be good news that the UK is hosting the World Congress on Artificial Intelligence in November, according to Ricketts, but AI standard setting will likely be happening between the larger blocs. The US-EU Trade and Technology Council, the TTC, a leading forum for discussing all technical issues, not only speaks of interesting partnerships in the world of technical regulation, but also means that the UK is not in the brainstorming and ultimately gaining global regulatory clout will be an uphill battle for London. 7 years after the referendum, it remains difficult to grasp the full impact of Brexit, particularly in relation to foreign policy and the economy. It is debatable whether Brexit is what caused the sluggish growth and spiraling inflation that the UK has experienced over the past years. In Ricketts' view, I am quite sure it is. Despite this, forecasts by the UK Financial Conduct Authority, OBR, point to a 4% fall in productivity in the UK. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, a duty and quota-free trade pact, now tariff and quota-free trade pact, that came into force in January 21, also means that both exports and imports will be about 15% lower in the long term than if the United Kingdom would have stayed in the EU, according to the OBR. Trade deals with non-EU countries, on the other hand, will not have a material impact on UK economic growth. I think there's general consensus that Brexit is one of the reasons why we currently have the lowest GDP growth and the highest inflation among the G7 countries, Ricketts said. Hopes expressed at the start of the Brexit debate that London could do away with many regulations and become a kind of a Singapore on the Thames to maximize its comparative advantage in financial services has become a minority view, according to Ricketts. The more the government considered a barrage of regulations, the more it realized that each regulation had a reason for its existence, he said. And according to Ricketts, the interest of the companies is a level playing field in order to avoid additional costs. The reality is that business is pushing for as much regulatory alignment as possible with the EU, according to Ricketts. Looking ahead, the EU and the UK are preparing for the 2024 elections ahead of the 2025 FTA review. Could 2025 be an opportunity for a more fundamental realignment of relations that future British government might seek? That's a question Ricketts asks, and that would depend on the political willingness on both sides, although it's not clear that the Commission, even under new leadership, wants to do that when it has to think about Ukraine, enlargement, and 100 other things. And I can answer Ricketts there, most probably not. Instead, the new EU Commission could settle for a light technical check and ensure full implementation is possible before fully approving the next steps. The House of Lords report calls on both parties to reach an agreement on the sanitary and phytosanitary regulations before the agreement is rediscussed or just checked. One could consider energy cooperation, the emissions trading system, and the CBAM, which regulates CO2 emissions, mobility issues, and the EU's common foreign and security policy, in Ricketts' point of view. Eventually, the scope of the review will be determined with new personalities and possibly a new political agenda, Ricketts said. In the EU, it might state the same as well. The question of what is up for grabs in 2025 is still completely undecided. But long before that, there's currently Brexit chaos with fish and meat. Because despite Brexit, food from the EU is entering the British market unchecked. Now a customs system is finally to be introduced, which the EU has had for a long time. But Britain's Brexit is dragging on. Although the exit from the EU was in January 2020, until the effects of this decision fully hit the economy, as things stand today, it will no longer be a Conservative government that will have to bear the consequences, but a Labour-led one. Elections must be made by January 2025 at the latest, and this also applies to the new border checks that Britain would actually have to carry out after Brexit when importing food and plants from the EU. Checks that check, for example, whether plants are infested with pests or whether meat, milk, fish, and honey meet the health and hygiene requirements of the importing country. The process is complicated, lengthy, and therefore expensive, and the EU introduced the checks after the Brexit transition period ended on January 1st, 2021, and the UK did not. You might have seen my videos on that. In Calais, in northern France, tests are already being carried out for a long time, and their inspection bodies have to approve the conformity of British products and approve the import of the goods into the EU, regardless of customs. Otherwise, the lorry will have to turn back and drive back to the UK, or the goods will be destroyed. The export must be announced at least one day before crossing the border and entered in this European online database Traces. Without the health certificate document generated by the system, the goods cannot be dispatched. The checks and the complexity of the system have meant, among other things, that UK exports of food and live animals to the EU have fallen by 19%, from £870 million a month to £704 million since September 20. And this is despite the fact that the trend was upwards in the years before. The British government has repeatedly delayed the same checks on its sides, on the one hand because they wanted to design a streamlined system for EU imports and give their importers more time to change over. Above all, however, the introduction of controls would have shown that trade with the EU would not function smoothly after Brexit, as the Conservative ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson had claimed. The consequence, of course, is that much of to the annoyance of the British farmers, EU products are entering the British market unhindered and unchecked. Imports of food and live animals have therefore risen from £2.46 billion to £3.07 billion since September 20. That means by 24.8%, although the market had stagnated for years before Brexit. In August, the government postponed border checks for a fifth time, and they are now being introduced in stages, products divided into 3 risk categories. For example, bees and raw eggs belong in the high-risk category, milk, fish and meat in the middle category. For example, canned dog food and honey are now in the low-risk category. From January 31st in 2024, transport companies must submit health certificates for products in the medium and high-risk classes. Products in the low-risk category do not need these. However, all goods must be pre-declared with appropriate customs and commercial documents. The checks will begin in April 24, but products in the high-risk class are already being checked then. From October 31st, 24, transport companies must also present goods and security declarations when crossing borders. And special rules apply to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. We know about the Windsor Framework. But these dates only are on paper right now. But we had a lot of dates and deadlines before, and so I will only believe them when I see them. I mean, we had 5 delays already. But if you want to know more about Brexit or UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.